He is standing at the edge of the crowd, not seated among them, and the morning light over the agora is the particular flat white of spring in Athens before the heat has gathered. He is 27 years old. He has known this man, Socrates, for most of the decade. He has been old enough to understand what a philosophical argument is. And what is happening now in this assembly of 500 citizens is that those citizens are preparing to vote on whether Socrates should die. Plato stands at the edge, close enough to see the older man's face, close enough to watch him stand without flinching before the gathered population of the city he has spent his entire life walking through, asking questions in. The hemlock has not been prepared. The sentence has not been passed. The vote has not been taken. There is still a moment, a breath, between the world that contains Socrates and the world that will not. Plato is standing in that breath. He will not forget what the raised hands look like. He will not forget the sound of the verdict being announced, nor the particular quality of silence that follows it. Not absence of sound exactly, but the way air feels when something has left it. What he knows in that moment, standing at the margin of the crowd, is something he will spend the rest of his life trying to find the right words for. That the most just person he has ever encountered has just been judged, unjust by the democratic machinery of a city that calls itself free, and that this means something about justice and about cities and about the distance between the two, that he does not yet have the language to name. The Republic begins here, not in the abstract, not in the formal movement of an argument, but in the body of a young man standing at the edge of a crowd in an Athenian spring, watching 500 hands go up. It begins with a wound. Athens, in the years before Plato's birth, had been the most powerful city in the Greek world, and the decades of his childhood were the long contraction of that power, a shrinking visible in the faces of older men, in the tone of civic speeches, in the particular exhaustion that settles into a city that has been fighting for too long and knows somewhere below its public confidence that it is losing. The Peloponnesian War, which had consumed Greece for nearly 30 years, ended when Plato was a young man in his 20s, and its ending was not the quiet resolution of a long conflict, but a rupture. Sparta imposed the government that history would call the 30 tyrants, 30 Athenian men given authority to remake the city according to Spartan terms, accountable to no one, constrained by nothing that could reasonably be called law. Plato knew some of them. His uncle Charmides was among them. His relative Critias was their most powerful member. These were not strangers from a conquered city. They were men he had seen at dinner tables, in doorways, in the ordinary spaces of an aristocratic Athenian boyhood. And what they did with their power in the months of their governance was kill people. They killed people who disagreed with them. They killed people who might disagree with them. They killed people because killing had become, in the logic of a government without constraints, the most efficient way to prevent the problem of opposition from arising. In 13 months, they executed approximately 1,500 Athenians. Charmides walked among them. Plato watched from the distance that a 20-something aristocrat, related to powerful men but not yet powerful himself, occupies close enough to know, far enough to be unable to prevent anything. What he understood from that watching was a thing about power that is different from what most people who have not watched it understand, that proximity to power is not the same thing as proximity to justice, that the people who make decisions are not, by virtue of making decisions, the people who make the right ones, that family connection, education, wealth, the habits of what he would later call the ruling class, none of these are guarantees. None of these are even reliable indicators. The 30 tyrants lasted 13 months. Democracy was restored, And then 9 years later, under that restored democracy, Socrates was tried and executed. It would be easy to draw the simple lesson from this sequence that tyranny kills and therefore democracy is better. Plato drew a different lesson. Both governments had produced injustice. The tyranny had done so quickly and without shame. The democracy had done so slowly, with deliberation, surrounded by the procedural forms of civic life, and had called the result justice. The problem, as Plato came to see it, was not a problem of which form of government was in power. The problem was that neither form had any principled understanding of what justice actually was, and so neither form had any reliable mechanism for producing it. A city whose governing class does not know what justice is will produce injustice. The form of its government determines only the shape and pace of the damage. This was not a comfortable conclusion to arrive at. It required Plato to stand outside both of the worlds that claimed him, the oligarchic world of his family connections and the democratic world of his citizenship, and to find that neither of them could be justified on the terms they offered. He writes about this in the autobiographical letter that scholars call the seventh letter, with a clarity that is entirely calm and entirely devastating. He had hoped, he says, when the 30 came to power, that they would restore justice to the city. He watched them instead make the city more unjust in a single year than it had been in many years before. Then democracy returned, and he took heart. Then democracy killed Socrates, and he understood as a conclusion, not as a defeat, that no existing state was governed well, that all existing constitutions were bad, and that a genuine reform of political life would require, before anything else, a real understanding of what justice was. Not a conventional understanding, not the understanding that says justice is paying your debts and helping your friends. A real one, hard and careful enough to survive contact with the worst a political situation can produce. He was in his early 30s when he came to this conclusion. He had most of his life ahead of him. There is a particular discipline in the turning away from the world as it is, toward the question of what it should be, when that turning away is not despair, but patience. Plato did not leave philosophy. He left politics. The distinction matters because the leaving of politics was not a concession to the world's intractability, but a philosophical judgment that the questions had to be answered before the actions could be taken, and that answering them would take time of a kind that political life could not contain. He had watched what happened when people acted without the answers, and he had watched it with his own uncle. He was not going to make the same mistake on a smaller scale. What Socrates had shown him in all the years of walking through Athens and asking questions was that almost no one who used the word justice knew what they meant by it. They used it the way people use words they have inherited, confidently, casually, without inspection. The merchant meant one thing, the general meant another. The democratic orator meant something else again. And when pressed, when Socrates sat down with them and followed the word wherever it led, refusing every comfortable stopping place, the word dissolved into inconsistency, self-contradiction, the revelation of a confidence that had never been earned. This was not a comfortable thing to watch happen, especially if you were the one being questioned. Socrates was not widely loved in Athens. He was admired and resented, and followed by young men who found the spectacle of careful thinking thrilling, and he was misunderstood and feared by older men who thought that what he was doing with their city's foundational assumptions was dangerous. They were right that it was dangerous. They were wrong about what it endangered. It endangered only the comfortable, unearned certainty that is the precondition of injustice in practice. The justice itself, whatever it actually was, Socrates was trying to find, not to destroy. Plato had been one of the young men following, and then the city had killed the man he was following, and Plato had understood, for the first time, with the particular clarity that comes from witnessing the worst, that the question of what justice was had not been answered. The executed man had not gotten to the answer. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that would take the Republic's length to work through, perhaps the executed man's willingness to die rather than to lie had been the answer, or at least the shape of it, the outline of what a just soul looks like when the city around it has entirely failed. Socrates in prison was offered escape. His friends had arranged it. The guards could be persuaded to look away. The door could be left open. The journey to a neighboring city could be made in the night. He refused. He refused, not because he was resigned to death or because he thought the city's verdict was correct, but because he had spent his life arguing that the laws of the city, even when they produced unjust results, formed a structure that a citizen who had lived his life within them was not free to simply abandon when the results became personally inconvenient. He would not do, in his last days, what he had spent his life arguing should not be done. He would not let the pressure of circumstance become the reason for an inconsistency. And so he sat with his friends in his last hours and talked about whether the soul was immortal and whether death was something to fear, and he died with the conversation still open. Plato reconstructed this day in a dialogue called the Phaedo, and what the reconstruction reveals between every line of the philosophical argument is the image that had fixed itself in his mind when he was 27 years old and watching from the crowd. The image of a man whose inner life was so completely ordered that external events, even the worst external event, the end of life itself, could not disorder it. That was what a just soul looked like. That was the thing the city had tried to evaluate and condemned and killed and failed in its killing to touch. The form of justice persisted in the man, even when the city's verdict went entirely against it. Whatever justice was, it was not conferred by political approval or destroyed by political condemnation. It was something else, something interior, something structural. This was the beginning of the question. Athens is a city built on a hill, or beside one, the Acropolis at its center, the Parthenon visible from nearly every point in the city, the temples and the agoras, and the long roads to the harbor spread below. It is a city of vertical sightlines, where looking up is built into the architecture of civic life. The harbor, the Piraeus, is different, flatter, busier, more horizontal, full of ships and traders, and the specific noise of commercial exchange. It is the part of Athens that faces outward, toward the sea, toward the rest of the world, toward the constant movement of people and goods and ideas that the harbor makes possible. When Plato staged his great dialogue about justice, the conversation that would become the Republic, he staged it in the Piraeus, in the house of a wealthy man named Cephalus, and he did this deliberately. The most cosmopolitan, fluid, pluralistic space in the Athenian world is where he chose to ask what stable, enduring justice was. The setting is itself a philosophical argument, though it makes it quietly, through placement rather than assertion. He was perhaps 36 or 37 when he founded the Academy. It occupied a grove outside the city's walls, an olive grove, because Athens was a city of olives, the sacred tree of Athena, the ancient ones, silver-leafed and thick-trunked in the particular way of trees that have been growing for centuries without being asked to be useful to anything but themselves. The grove was sacred to a hero named Academos, which is where the name came from. Outside the city walls, and sacred and full of old trees. These are not incidental details. A school for philosophy, placed in a space already held by something older than philosophy, outside the normal civic boundaries, organized not around the preparation of orators or soldiers or bureaucrats, but around the question of how to live and govern well. It was not a retreat from politics. This is the misunderstanding that is easiest to make about the academy and about Plato's intellectual life in general, that the turn toward thinking is the abandonment of action. He believed the opposite. The crisis of Athens, as he understood it, was not a crisis of bad men in positions of power. It was a crisis of miseducation, of a political culture that produced rulers who did not know what justice was, and therefore could not practice it reliably. The academy was his attempt to produce, over time, a different kind of person, someone whose education had gone all the way down to the foundations, who had genuinely confronted the hard questions and found real answers, or at least understood why the easy answers failed. The Republic is, among other things, a description of what that education would look like, and what kind of city it would eventually, if everything went right, produce. Everything did not go right. Plato made 3 journeys to Syracuse, in Sicily, to the court of a tyrant named Dionysius, first the father, then the son, carrying with him the conviction that a philosopher at the ear of a powerful ruler could be the hinge on which a better kind of governance turned. The conviction was not naive, or rather, it was the specific kind of hope that a serious thinker holds when the alternative, abandoning the possibility of political reform entirely, is, philosophically, worse. If the questions can be answered, and the answers can be taught, and the teaching can shape the people who hold power, then the journey is worth making. If none of those conditions hold, then perhaps the questions are worth asking anyway. But the hope that all 3 might hold together, and that Syracuse might become the demonstration of the possible, is a hope he carried 3 times across the Ionian Sea. None of the journeys achieved what he wanted. Dionysius the elder was too old and too committed to the habits of power to be educated. Dionysius the younger was genuinely interested, or appeared to be, interested enough that a man named Dion, who was Plato's closest friend at the Syracusan court, and who believed more fervently than even Plato in the possibility of the philosopher-statesman, thought the education might take hold. It did not. Dionysius grew suspicious, or grew bored, or grew into the ordinary tyrannical suspicion of any powerful man who finds himself surrounded by people who seem to know more than he does. The 3rd journey ended badly enough that Plato's freedom was briefly in question. He came home. Dion later led a military campaign against Dionysius, seized power briefly, and was assassinated by his own followers. The academy existed for over 900 years after Plato's death, well into the late Roman period, outlasting countless political arrangements, surviving the fall of several empires, continuing to produce thinkers long after the specific political project it was designed to serve had dissolved into history. This is either ironic or appropriate, depending on how one reads the relationship between philosophy and its occasions. The questions outlasted the city that produced them. They are still being asked. What the 3 Syracusan failures reveal, without resolution, is the gap between what Plato believed about the relationship between philosophical wisdom and political power, and what the world was willing to demonstrate about that relationship. He believed, and the Republic is the extended argument for this belief, that a city governed by those who genuinely understood justice would be more just than any city governed otherwise. He had no evidence by the end of his life that this belief was true. He had the academy, which continued, He had the dialogues, which were being read. He had the question itself, which had not been answered, but had been refined, carefully, over decades of teaching and writing and revision, into something that could at least be held and turned and examined. He died around 348 BCE, in his early 80s, still in Athens. Some ancient sources say he died at a wedding feast. Others say he died in his sleep. Both endings have a particular quality that is hard to call accidental. A man who had spent his life arguing that the soul's right order produces a kind of inner peace might, if he achieved it, die at a celebration or in the peaceful dark. The olive grove that housed the academy was, in his time, a short walk from the city walls. You could see the Acropolis from the edge of the grove if the air was clear, which in the Athenian autumn it often is, a particular dry, transparent light that makes distant things visible and gives the quality of sharpness to outlines that in other seasons blur. The grove itself, in the late afternoon, would have settled into the specific quiet of old trees and low light, the silver green of the olive leaves catching what was left of the sun, the buildings modest and without grandeur, a few people moving between them, or sitting in conversation, or sitting alone with a thought they had not yet finished. The question of what justice was had not been answered. Not fully, not in a way that would have satisfied Plato if he had been honest about it, which he generally was. The Republic is a long book, and its central argument that justice in the soul is the right ordering of its parts under the governance of reason, and that justice in the city is the right ordering of its classes under the governance of those who understand the good, is developed with care and sustained over hundreds of pages of argument and counter-argument and image and story. But Plato does not present it as a closed case. He presents it as the best answer he has found, which is different. The dialogues are not doctrines, they are conversations, and conversations by their nature remain open. What was certain by the end of his life was that the question mattered. It had mattered in the Agora. When Socrates asked it of merchants and soldiers, and anyone who would stop long enough to talk, it had mattered at the trial when a democratic city answered it badly and killed the man who had asked it. It had mattered in the Piraeus, in the conversation that became the Republic, when younger men sat with an older one and tried to find a definition that would hold. It had mattered in Syracuse, even when the Syracusan answer was silence and the failure of a political hope. It had mattered in the academy, where generation after generation of students sat with the dialogues and the arguments and the questions and found them still alive. It had mattered in the way that only a question touching something real can matter, not producing urgency, but producing patience, the willingness to keep asking past the point where easier questions would have settled for their first sufficient answer. The olive grove in the late afternoon, buildings without grandeur, a garden, men and women gathering in it, not to govern anything, not to vote or to decree or to manage the business of the city, but to think, to ask the question again, more carefully, from the beginning, with the kind of patient attention that is the only instrument the question responds to. The Academy's buildings are long gone. The trees may or may not be the same trees, or their descendants. The grove is a park now, in a modern city, and people walk through it on the way to other places. But in Plato's times, on an autumn evening when the Acropolis was visible in the clear dry light, and the olive leaves were moving slightly in the end of the day's warmth, the question was, there in the grove, the same way it is always there when enough honest attention is brought to it. Not solved, not abandoned, but held carefully in the open by people who understood that the holding was the work, and that the work was worth doing, and that it would be continued tomorrow and after tomorrow for as long as the question had not settled. The question had not settled, it would not settle quickly, and the particular patience required to sit with an unsettled question, to resist the temptation of the easy answer, to resist the opposite temptation of despair at the absence of any answer, to stay carefully and without hurry in the genuine difficulty. That patience was what Plato had learned from the man he watched die. It was what Socrates had demonstrated in the last conversation of his life, in the particular quality of his calm, not the calm of a man who has given up, but the calm of a man who has found, in the long practice of honest thinking, something that external events cannot easily reach. Whether that something is what the Republic means by justice is the question the Republic asks. It does not entirely answer it. No conversation does. But the asking done carefully enough, over a long enough time, by enough people willing to put down the easy answers and start again, produces something that is not an answer, but is not nothing either, a shape, a direction, a sense of where the question lives, and what it requires of anyone willing to follow it into the dark. The grove settles in the dusk. The questions remain in it, quiet and patient, asking nothing from anyone tonight. They will still be there in the morning, and in the morning after that, as they have been there for every morning since a young man stood at the edge of a crowd in an Athenian spring and understood, for the first time, that the most important question he had never thought to ask was the one he had just watched his city answer wrong. In the courtyard of Cephalus, the evening has already begun to soften the edges of things. The old man has returned from a sacrifice at a nearby shrine, and the smell of incense still clings to the folds of his robe, faint and sweet, the kind of smell that lingers on a person who has just performed an act he considers an obligation well met. His hands rest open on his knees. There is about him the particular ease of someone who has made peace with the question of how to live, not through long philosophical struggle, but through the gradual, almost unconscious accumulation of a life he considers honest. He has told the truth when he could. He has paid his debts. He has made the right offerings at the right times. For Cephalus, these things are not a philosophy. They are simply what a good man does. Socrates is watching him with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who already suspects that what looks like an answer is actually a kind of starting place. He listens as Cephalus speaks. He does not interrupt. The harbor of the Piraeus is just visible through a doorway at the far end of the courtyard. The ships dark against the last light, the smell of the sea working its way inland and mixing with the incense. Cephalus talks about old age, about the relief of no longer being pulled around by appetite, about the way money is useful mainly because it makes honesty easier. You can pay what you owe and go to sleep without dread. Socrates hears all of this, and then, gently, with the tone of a man genuinely curious rather than adversarial, he asks the first question. What is justice, Cephalus? Is it simply this, telling the truth and returning what you have borrowed? The old man smiles. He thinks that is roughly what he meant. He turns the conversation over to his son Polemarchus and goes back inside to oversee the sacrifice, satisfied, not knowing that the definition he has handed off will not survive the evening, or that its failure will open a door that no one in the courtyard will fully close again. The counterexample Socrates offers is small and precise. Suppose a friend, he says, left a weapon in your keeping when he was in full possession of his mind, and he comes back to reclaim it, now in a state of madness, threatening harm. Is it just to return what you borrowed? Cephalus's definition says yes, That is what was owed. But something in every person who hears this resists, because what seems just in the general case becomes something else entirely when it is placed in a specific context, when the person who is owed and the person who will be harmed are real, when the rule meets the grain of an actual situation and the two do not lie flat. Justice cannot mean following a rule without regard for what the rule is doing in the world. That much seems clear, but if justice is not that, what is it? Polemarchus is young and eager to argue well. He has inherited both the conversation and the definition, and he sets about improving it with the confidence of someone who believes the problem is merely a matter of precision. The old poet Simonides, he says, said that justice is giving each what they are owed, and he interprets this to mean something more specific and aristocratic, helping your friends and harming your enemies. This is not an unusual view. In the world Polemarchus inhabits, loyalty and rivalry are among the primary moral facts. The idea that a just person would stand by their allies and oppose those who oppose them has the ring of plain good sense, the kind of view that does not need a philosopher to defend it, because most people already believe it without ever having been asked. Socrates receives this with the same careful attention. He walks Polemarchus through the definition, step by patient step, not attacking it, but extending it, following the logic to the places Polemarchus has not yet looked. A musician, Socrates says, makes people musical through the exercise of musical skill. A doctor makes people healthy through the exercise of medical skill. Every craft or art, when properly practiced, produces its characteristic benefit in the thing it is applied to. So if justice is a kind of human excellence, a kind of skill or virtue, then what does a just person produce through the exercise of justice? What are they making better through just action? Polemarchus thinks the just person makes their friends better and their enemies worse. Socrates holds the second part of this up quietly. Does a skilled horseman make horses worse through skilled horsemanship? Does a musician make people less musical through skilled musicianship? The craftsman, in the full exercise of their art, does not degrade the thing they work on. That would be the failure of the art, not its fulfillment. And if justice is genuinely a human virtue, genuinely a kind of excellence, can a just act ever make anyone worse than they were? Can the exercise of justice be, in its proper expression, a form of harm? Polemarchus goes quiet, in the way people go quiet when a belief they have carried for a long time has just been carefully, irreversibly removed from them. Not with distress, exactly, more with the specific stillness of someone who is realizing that the space where that belief used to be is larger than they thought. He does not capitulate dramatically. He simply has nothing left to say that holds. The definition has been extended past its own limits, and what remains is not a new answer, but an open space where the question now lives more honestly than it did before. The conversation might have continued along those quieter lines for some time, working its way toward a more refined account, testing definitions with care and setting them aside when they broke, the way a careful craftsman tests a joint and rejects the boards that will not hold. But then a new voice enters, and the quality of the inquiry changes entirely. Thrasymachus has been present for some time, sitting with the barely contained energy of a man who finds the proceeding naive. He is a sophist, a professional teacher of argument, skilled in the arts of persuasion, contemptuous of what he regards as philosophical play-acting. He has been waiting, visibly restless, and now he breaks through. The image of his entry into the conversation is that of a stone dropped into still water. Not a violent entry, but a decisive one, and the ripples spread outward in every direction and do not easily stop. What Thrasymachus says is this: Justice is the advantage of the stronger. Every ruling power, every governing class, every dominant group defines what is right and calls that definition justice, and then requires everyone beneath it to comply. The Athenian democracy calls its arrangements just. The Spartan oligarchy calls its arrangements just. The tyrant calls his decrees just. In each case, what is being called justice is simply the interest of the people with the power to name it. Those who comply are called just, and they are fools because they are serving the advantage of someone other than themselves. And the only rational response to the political world is to understand this clearly and to pursue one's own advantage with equal directness, shedding the moral vocabulary that has been used to obscure the actual structure of things. This is not a shallow position. It would be a mistake to receive it as the argument of a merely cynical man, though Thrasymachus is also that. The structural observation he is making, that what a society calls justice often reflects the interests of those with the power to define the terms, is one that later thinkers would spend centuries examining, finding in it not the end of the moral question, but one of the places where the moral question becomes most genuinely difficult. Thrasymachus has looked at political life and seen something real. He has seen that the vocabulary of justice can be used as a cover for domination. He has noticed that the arrangements which benefit the powerful tend, with remarkable consistency, to be the arrangements that get called right and good and just. He is not wrong about the observation. What he is proposing, though, is not only an observation, but a conclusion that the observation exhausts what justice is, that there is nothing behind the word except the advantage that someone has managed to secure and dress in moral language. Socrates sits entirely still in the silence after this. There is in that stillness nothing reactive. He is not assembling a refutation. He is not preparing a counterblow. He is genuinely sitting with what has been said, turning it over, feeling for the place where it holds and the place where it reaches its limit. The quality of his attention is such that even Thrasymachus, who entered the conversation expecting evasion and irony, is momentarily held by it. What Socrates reaches for first is the analogy of craft. A doctor, in their proper function as a doctor, exercises their skill for the benefit of the patient. A navigator, in their proper function as a navigator, exercises their skill for the benefit of the ship and those on it. In each case, the skilled person is serving something other than their own direct advantage when they exercise their art. This is not incidental to what the art is, it is constitutive of it. The doctor who poisons the patient is not practicing medicine badly. They have ceased to practice medicine at all, and have substituted something else wearing medicine's name. If governance is an art, Socrates is asking, what is it the art of? What is the thing it serves? The way medicine serves the patient's health, and navigation serves the ship's course. Thrasymachus has assumed that governance is a competition, a contest of strength and cunning, in which the winner appropriately takes the benefit. But what if it is, or could be, more like medicine, a practice whose excellence is defined by what it produces for those it governs, rather than for those who govern? Thrasymachus is not immediately convinced by this. He responds with the example of a shepherd who fattens the flock, not for the flock's benefit, but for slaughter, for the advantage of the owner. The ruler is like this shepherd. The apparent service conceals the actual dynamic of exploitation. Socrates gently distinguishes the shepherd from the shepherd as profit maker, the art from its incidental accompaniments, and the conversation continues through these careful distinctions, each one tested and either set aside or kept, the way a person carries tools and puts down the ones that turn out not to be needed. None of this entirely settles Thrasymachus. He is not the kind of person who is easily settled, but something shifts in his participation. The aggressive energy begins to flatten slightly into something more like sullenness than into something more like genuine listening. He continues to disagree, but the disagreement has lost its contemptuous edge and has become instead something more honest, the real intellectual friction of a person who still believes he is right, but has stopped being certain that the other side has nothing to offer. The method Socrates is using through all of this is worth pausing on, not as a technique to be named and cataloged, but as something to be felt, because the feeling of it is different from ordinary argument. He is not presenting a thesis and defending it. He is not trying to win. He begins each exchange by drawing out what the other person actually believes, asking not rhetorical questions designed to trap, but genuine questions designed to understand. Then, slowly and without aggression, he follows the implications of those beliefs to the places they lead. And at those places, often, there is a contradiction, a commitment held simultaneously with another commitment that undermines it, the two beliefs sitting together in the same person's mind without awareness of their incompatibility. When the contradiction becomes visible, Socrates does not celebrate. He sits with it. He lets it be what it is, not a defeat for the person who held the contradiction, but an honest acknowledgement of the difficulty of the question. The word for this state, the state of genuine puzzlement that clears the ground for real inquiry, is aporia. The path forward has become unclear, and this unclarity is not a failure, but a precondition. The person who believes they know what justice is will not look for it. The person who has been walked gently to the edge of their own certainty is ready, for the first time, to genuinely search. The setting of all of this is worth holding quietly in the mind. Callipolis, the ideal city Socrates will eventually build an argument, is a place of stable hierarchy, of each element holding to its proper function, of order tending toward permanence. The Piraeus, where this conversation is actually taking place, is almost the direct inversion of that image. It is the port district of Athens, cosmopolitan, commercially vigorous, full of foreign traders and freed men, and the restless energy of a place where the sea brings constant change. There are no stable hierarchies in the Piraeus. There is the noise of commerce, the smell of fish and rope and salt water, the meeting of people from a dozen different cities and cultures, each with their own arrangements of what is right. This is the most pluralistic and fluid space in the Athenian world, and it is here, in the midst of all that motion and variety, that Socrates and his companions are trying to ask whether any stable account of justice can be found at all. The contrast is not an accident. Plato placed his dialogue about order in a space defined by its disorder, and the choice is philosophically precise. The question of justice does not arise in conditions of settled agreement. It arises at the edges of things, where different arrangements meet and their claims press against each other, where the assumption that we all know what is right begins to dissolve in the presence of genuine difference. The Piraeus is where that pressure is felt most directly, where the comfortable conviction that justice is simply what one has always done and what one's community has always practiced becomes suddenly visible as a conviction rather than a fact, subject to the same questioning that has just undone the definitions of Cephalus and Polemarchus. None of the three definitions put forward in this part of the conversation survives the evening. Cephalus's, that justice is paying your debts and telling the truth, proves too mechanical, too indifferent to circumstances, too willing to produce harm in the name of rule following. Polemarchus's, that justice is helping friends and harming enemies, proves unable to survive the observation that a genuine virtue cannot produce harm in its proper exercise. Thrasymachus's, that justice is the advantage of the stronger, that the moral vocabulary is a mask for power, is more durable, and its durability is part of what makes the rest of the conversation necessary. It does not fall cleanly. Socrates does not refute it, so much as open questions around it. Ask what it would mean if governance were genuinely an art, what it would mean if the person governing were the one least interested in power as a reward. By the time the first major movement of the evening's argument has concluded, the question has not been answered. It has been made genuinely difficult in a way that it was not before. The easy answers have been carefully removed, one by one, with respect and without mockery, and what remains is an honest space in which the question now lives, not settled, not shelved, but open in the particular way that only questions which have survived real examination can be open. This is aporia, the specific philosophical state of mind that Socrates has been working toward all evening, not as a rhetorical maneuver, but as a genuine clearing of the ground. And the ground needs to be clear, because what will be built on it is large. Socrates is not done. Neither is the question. The conversation has, in one sense, gone nowhere. None of the definitions has stood. No positive account of justice has been produced. The group in Cephalus's house has arrived at something that looks very much like not knowing. But the not knowing is different now from the comfortable assumption they started with. It has been earned. It has been examined. It is the particular not knowing of people who have looked carefully and found the question genuinely difficult, which is the only foundation on which anything true about justice could eventually be built. There is something in this method, this patient, careful dismantling of what people think they know in order to make space for what they might actually find, that is itself a kind of quiet portrait of what justice might require. It requires honesty about what you do not know. It requires willingness to follow an argument where it leads rather than to where you want it to arrive. It requires the kind of patience that does not reach for conclusions before the ground has been properly prepared. These are not characteristics of every kind of inquiry. They are, in Plato's understanding, the characteristics of a particular kind of mind, the philosophical mind, the mind genuinely ordered toward truth rather than toward the appearance of truth, toward the thing itself rather than toward the convenient answer that will let you go home satisfied. The evening in the Piraeus is not that mind's triumph. It is that mind's first real movement, the moment when the question is genuinely opened, when the comfortable certainties have been gently but honestly removed, when the people gathered in the courtyard of Cephalus have become without quite intending it. Philosophers in the only sense that matters, people genuinely uncertain about something, genuinely important, and genuinely willing to sit with that uncertainty rather than reach for an answer they have not earned. Glaucon is in the room. Adeimantus is in the room. They are Plato's brothers, and they will become, in the movements that follow, the primary interlocutors, the ones who will press the question hardest, who will ask Socrates to prove that justice is worth choosing even when it is costly, who will demand an account that goes all the way down rather than one that merely defeats the easy objections. Their presence in the courtyard this evening means that the conversation is not over, even when it seems to have reached a stopping place. They have heard Thrasymachus, and they are not fully satisfied with the response, not because they agree with Thrasymachus, they do not, but because they feel the force of his challenge in a way that Socrates' craft analogies have not entirely addressed. They will ask the question again tomorrow, more sharply, with more pressure. But that is later. For now, the evening light in the Piraeus has shifted to night. The harbor sounds have quieted slightly, the trading done, the ships at rest against the docks. The smell of incense has faded almost entirely from Cephalus's robe, or from the air of the courtyard, or perhaps it has simply become indistinguishable from the general smell of the night. Inside the house, the old man is performing his religious duties, content in his simple account of how a good life is lived. Outside, in the courtyard, his son and his son's guests are sitting in the wreckage of that account, not with cruelty. Polemarchus does not feel that his father has been harmed, but with the specific alertness of people who have found the question genuinely interesting and are in no hurry to resolve it falsely. The harbor is dark now. The stars above the Piraeus are the same stars that appear above every city in the world, and the question of what justice is, whether it is something real that can be found and known, or whether it is a word the powerful give to their own arrangements, is as old as the stars and has not been settled by them. Thrasymachus believes he has told the truth about it. Polemarchus has been relieved of a belief he held without examining. Cephalus has gone inside, and Socrates sits in the courtyard, in the particular stillness of a person who has made the question genuinely difficult and does not experience this as a problem, but as the beginning of something, unhurried, patient, open to wherever the argument will lead. When the sun comes up again, and there is more time and more honesty, and the question can be turned over in the light and looked at carefully, as though for the very first time. The night air off the Piraeus is cool. The water is dark at the harbor's edge. The arguments of the evening settle slowly into the silence, the way sediment settles in still water, not resolved but resting, and in their resting somehow more clearly visible than they were when the conversation was in motion. Thrasymachus's challenge rests there with them. It has the weight of a real observation about a real world, and it does not become lighter because the evening has ended. Socrates knows this. He has not dispatched it. He has sat beside it and walked around it and opened the questions that it opens without fully answering, and the questions remain open, unhurried, waiting. There is a quality in questions that have been genuinely opened, as opposed to questions that have merely been asked. The latter arrive and depart and leave no mark. The former arrive and take up residence, and the next morning they are still there, and the morning after that, and eventually they stop feeling like intruders and begin to feel like companions, part of the landscape of a mind that has stopped trying to finish with them and started learning to think in their company. The question of justice is one of those. In the Piraeus, in the courtyard of Cephalus, in the late evening with the harbor smell on the air, it has taken up this kind of residence, permanent, unhurried, asking only to be thought about honestly and without the false reassurance of a definition that does not hold. Socrates sits still in the courtyard. The others are quiet. The stone beneath them holds the day's warmth still, slowly releasing it into the cooling night. Whatever answer eventually comes, and something will come, Socrates is not without resources. He has lived with this question longer than anyone present. It will not come tonight. Tonight the question sits open. The night sits open around it. The harbor at the Piraeus holds the dark water, and the dark water holds the stars' reflections, steady and cold, asking nothing back. Socrates traces something in the air with one hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, as though drawing letters on a surface that isn't there, and Glaucon watches him with the particular attention of someone who suspects the next words will matter. The gesture is small, the room is warm. Outside, in the Piraeus, the evening is settling over the harbor, and the sounds of the port have begun to soften into the quieter register of night. But inside this house, in the circle of men gathered around Socrates, the conversation has reached a point where something new is about to be tried, a new approach to a question that has already resisted every other angle they have brought to it. The question is justice. It has been handled and put down and handled again. Every definition that has been offered has eventually given way under examination, not through violence, but through the patient pressure of honest inquiry. And now Socrates lifts one hand, traces something slow and invisible, and says, "The letters are small when we try to read justice in a single soul. What if we read them somewhere larger first? What if we looked at a city? The proposal seems simple. It is not. Embedded in it is a claim about the relationship between the inner life of a person and the outer form of the world they inhabit together. The claim that these two things are not merely analogous, but structurally the same. That the shape of justice written in a soul and the shape of justice written in a city are the same shape, read at different sizes. To understand one is to understand both. To corrupt one is eventually to corrupt both. The connection runs deep enough that you cannot change the character of the governance without changing the character of the governed, and cannot change the character of the governed without the governance eventually following. Socrates is reaching for this because everything else has failed. The question needs a larger surface to hold it. So he begins with a city. The city Socrates describes does not begin with walls or armies or laws carved in stone. It begins with need. Human beings cannot provide everything for themselves alone. The farmer needs the builder needs the weaver needs the farmer. From this simple incompleteness, from the fact that a single person is not sufficient to a single life, the first city grows. There is a baker and a shoemaker. There is someone who works metal and someone who tends animals. The early form of the city is modest and unglamorous, what Socrates calls the city of pigs, with some gentle affection for its simplicity, a collection of needs finding their complementary satisfactions. But Glaucon objects, a truly human city, will want more than bread and shoes. It will want luxury and ornament and the pleasures that come with surplus. And so the city grows. It grows until it needs defenders. It grows until it needs administrators. It grows until it needs someone to determine, with more than casual thought, which way the whole thing ought to go. And here, in this expansion, the structure that Plato has been building toward begins to show its form. Three functions emerge from the needs of the larger city. There are those who produce, the farmers, the craftsmen, the traders, the weavers, the people whose work feeds and clothes and shelters the whole. There are those who defend, the guardians, the soldiers, the people whose courage and training stand between the city and everything that would undo it. And there are those who govern, the philosopher rulers, whose long education has brought them to a kind of knowledge that the other two groups, through no fault of their own, have not been trained to reach. Three groups, three functions, three kinds of people, suited by nature and shaped by education to the work that is, in some deep sense, their own. This is the city called Callipolis, the beautiful city, the good city, the city that exists first and most fully in the conversation of these men, and in whatever part of the mind is capable of holding a city that has never been built. It is not a blueprint. It is not a political platform. It is not a political, Plato says with some care, a model laid up in the heavens, something to be looked at and oriented toward, a pattern against which actual cities can be measured and found wanting or approximating, a way of asking what the arrangement of human beings together would look like if it were ordered the way a healthy thing is ordered, rather than the way a sick thing sprawls. Whether it can be built is a separate question, and Plato does not press it here. What matters now is whether it can be understood. The principle at the heart of Callipolis is one that Plato finds so fundamental, he expresses it in Greek that carries a kind of weight its translation doesn't fully convey. To hautopratein, each thing doing its own, each person performing the function for which their nature has prepared them, and not reaching into the functions of others. The farmer farming, the guardian guarding, the philosopher governing, not because the boundaries between these things are walls, but because the coherence of the whole depends on each part contributing what it alone is fitted to contribute, and the failure of that coherence, the farmer who wants to govern, the guardian who turns to trade, the ruler who governs for personal gain rather than for the city's good, is not merely inefficiency, it is a specific kind of disorder. It is the wrong thing in the wrong place, pulling against the grain of the whole arrangement. Justice, Plato is proposing, is this: the condition in which each element, in the city, in the soul, holds to its own proper function and allows the others to hold to theirs, not harming and not being harmed, not helping friends and harming enemies, not the advantage of the stronger, something quieter than any of those. The internal rightness of a thing whose parts are each where they belong. This is the proposal. Now Socrates moves to show the same structure in smaller letters. The soul, he says, has 3 parts. This is not a claim made casually. Plato arrives at it through a principle of conflict, the observation that a person can want 2 things at once that pull against each other, and that no single thing can be simultaneously the cause of opposite motions in the same respect at the same time. A person stands at the edge of a pool of still water and feels both thirsty and reluctant to drink, because the water looks brackish, because the hour is wrong, because something in them says not yet. 2 forces pulling in opposite directions, one desiring, one restraining. These cannot be the same part of the soul. From this basic observation of inner conflict, Plato builds his tripartite psychology. There is the part that desires, the epithemikon, the appetitive part, vast and powerful and various, the seat of hunger and thirst, and the wanting of wealth and comfort and all the pleasures that the body and its appetites know how to name. There is the part that reasons, the logistikon, the calculating part, the part that deliberates and weighs and asks which of the available choices is genuinely best and how to get there from here. And there is the third part, the one most difficult to name in English, the thymoides, the spirited part, sometimes translated as thumos, the part that is the seat of anger and ambition, and the indignation that rises when dignity is violated. Spirit is the part that makes a person want to be recognized for what they are worth. It is the part that turns a person toward honor, toward glory, toward the desire for achievement that is distinct from both appetite's comfort and reason's truth. In a well-ordered soul, spirit is the ally of reason, fierce and energetic and willing to fight, but pointed by reason in the right direction. In a disordered soul, spirit can become its own kind of tyrant, hungering for recognition and honor the way appetite hungers for food and pleasure. Each of these parts has its characteristic pleasure. Appetite takes pleasure in the satisfactions of the body, eating, drinking, wealth, comfort. Spirit takes pleasure in victory and honor and the respect of others. Reason takes pleasure in its own quiet way, in truth, in the contemplation of what is real and how things actually stand. And from this difference in what each part finds most pleasant, 3 different kinds of human character emerge: the money-loving person, whose appetite has the loudest voice, the honor-loving person, whose spirit drives the whole, and the wisdom-loving person, the philosopher, in whom reason governs and appetite and spirit serve their proper supporting roles. Plato does not suggest that appetite and spirit are enemies of the soul. This is a common misreading. Both are necessary. The appetites, in their proper place and under proper governance, are what keeps a person alive and embodied and able to do the things that reason recommends. Spirit, in its proper place, is the energy and the courage without which reason's conclusions could never be enacted in the world. The tripartite soul is not a hierarchy in which the higher parts hold the lower parts down. It is an arrangement in which each part contributes what it is fitted to contribute, and the whole becomes something none of the parts could be alone. The image Socrates does not quite give, but that the description calls to mind, is something like a ship, the navigator reading the sky, the oarsmen at their work, the cargo in the hold, each necessary, each in its proper position, the whole making a journey that none of the parts could make without the others. The navigator is not at war with the oarsmen. The cargo is not the enemy of the course, but the navigator must navigate. The oarsman must row. The cargo must stay in the hold. The ship that mistakes these arrangements, the cargo taking the helm, the navigator pulling at the oars, does not simply go more slowly. It does not arrive. The good life on this account is an internal arrangement. It is the condition of a soul in which reason governs the appetitive and spirited parts, not by suppressing them, but by directing them. Well, so that the life that results is unified rather than fractured, purposive rather than merely reactive, capable of the kind of long, deliberate movement toward what is genuinely good, that appetite alone, or spirit alone, could never sustain. This is what Plato means when he says that the just person is the healthy person. Health in medicine is not the absence of all the body's organs, but the right functioning of each organ in its proper relation to the others. Illness is not merely pain, it is the disruption of the right relationship between parts. And the analogy holds, Plato thinks, all the way down. The unjust soul is not a soul that contains appetite and spirit and reason and happens to have made some bad choices. It is a soul whose internal arrangement is disordered, in which appetite or spirit has usurped the place of reason, so that the whole is organized around the wrong center and pulls, in every decision and every action, against the grain of its own deepest nature. The four virtues of the Republic find their home here, in both the city and the soul simultaneously, because the city-soul analogy is not ornamental. It is the load-bearing structure of the whole argument. Wisdom lives in the reasoning part of the soul and in the class of philosopher rulers in the city. It is the virtue of the part that knows, not practical knowledge of a trade or a craft, but the kind of knowledge that understands what is genuinely good for the whole, that can hold the soul's or the city's full complexity in view, and make the decisions that serve everything at once. The city is called wise, not because every citizen is wise, but because those who govern it are, and because they govern with the good of the whole in view. The soul is called wise, not because reason knows everything, but because when reason is at the helm, it navigates by something other than mere appetite, or the desire for recognition. Courage lives in the spirited part of the soul, and in the class of auxiliaries in the city. It is not the absence of fear, but the capacity to hold to what reason has identified as the right course, even when appetite or circumstance pulls toward retreat. True courage is educated courage, not the recklessness of a person who has simply never been afraid, but the settled conviction of a person who has learned, through long and careful training, what is worth fearing and what is not, and whose spirit is disciplined enough to act on that distinction when the moment comes. Temperance is different from wisdom and courage in its location, It does not live exclusively in one part or one class. It is the virtue of agreement, the harmony that obtains when all three parts of the soul, or all three classes of the city, are in accord about who should lead and who should follow, when the appetitive part of the soul does not chafe against reason's governance, when the producing class does not resent the philosopher-ruler's authority. Temperance is a kind of music. It is the sound all three voices make when none of them is forcing the others flat, when the chord is clean because each voice has found its proper pitch. Socrates describes it with a particular care because it is the most fragile of the four virtues. Wisdom requires one thing to be in its right place. Courage requires one part to hold steady under pressure, but temperance requires all three to be in agreement, and agreement of that kind, in a soul or in a city, is something that has to be maintained. It is not achieved once and then permanent. It is an ongoing arrangement, a relationship among parts that could at any moment begin to loosen and drift. And justice, then, is the encompassing condition that makes the other three possible. When wisdom governs, courage defends, and temperance harmonizes, what holds the whole arrangement in its proper form is justice, the condition of each part doing its own work without reaching into the work of the others. Justice is not a virtue in the same sense that the other three are virtues. It is the condition of the soul, or the city, in which all the other virtues are able to do their work. It is the health of the whole. This is the definition that has been sought since the evening's conversation began. It arrives not with the energy of a revelation, but with the quieter satisfaction of something being recognized, a shape that was always there, becoming visible once the right light has been found. There is a version of this definition that seems almost too simple when first encountered. Doing your own thing, each part in its proper place. But the simplicity is deceptive, because the proposal carries implications that move in every direction at once. If justice is this, if it is fundamentally an internal arrangement, a structural rightness of parts in their proper relations, then the unjust person is not primarily someone who has done something wrong to someone else. The unjust person is someone whose inner life is already disordered, whose reason has already been displaced, whose appetites or ambitions have already taken what does not belong to them. The wrongful act in the world is the outward expression of an inward condition. The theft, the deception, the injustice done to another person. These are what happens when a soul that is already broken acts in the world according to its brokenness. This means that the project of justice is not, at its root, a political project. It is not primarily a matter of laws and punishments, and the arrangements that keep people from harming each other, though it includes all of those things. The root of the project is psychological. It is the work of ordering the inner life, training the parts of the soul to their proper functions, educating desire and spirit and reason so that they stand in the right relationship to each other, so that the person who emerges from that education is constitutionally incapable of certain kinds of disorder, not because they are prevented from them by external force, but because the arrangement of their inner life simply doesn't produce those movements. This is why the Republic spends so much of its length on education, on music and gymnastics, on the training of the spirited and appetitive parts, on the long curriculum of mathematics and philosophy that prepares the reasoning part for its work. Plato is not building a curriculum for its own sake. He is building souls. The city is in a sense a machine for producing well-ordered souls, and the well-ordered souls are in return the only people capable of maintaining a well-ordered city. The relationship is circular, and deliberately so, because Plato thinks that nothing short of this circularity will hold. The challenge that stands against all of this, and Plato is not unaware of it, is the question of who decides what each nature is fitted for. The principle of to hoto prateng, each doing their own, only does its work if the assignment of each person to their proper function is itself just. In Callipolis, this assignment is made through education and examination, the long process of identifying aptitudes, cultivating them, testing them, and allowing each person to find their level within the city's structure. The philosopher rulers are not born to rule. They are trained to it, tested through it, and distinguished from the other classes by their demonstrated capacity for the knowledge that governance requires. But the city still makes the determination, and the city's determination is made by the philosopher rulers who are already in place. The circularity here is not comfortable. Plato acknowledges it obliquely in the noble lie, the claim that the different metals in the souls of the different citizens are a natural fact, not a social assignment, though that lie and its implications belong to a separate and more troubled part of the Republic's argument. Here, in the clean architecture of the city soul analogy, it is enough to see the structure and to sit with the question it opens without trying to close it too quickly. The farmer in Callipolis wakes before dawn. The fields are still dark. He has work he knows how to do, work that the deepest part of his character is fitted for, and he moves through it with the particular competence and equanimity of a person whose outer life and inner life are aligned. He does not envy the guardians their weapons or the rulers their counsels, not because he has been told not to, but because the part of his soul that is most alive is the part that meets the earth and makes things grow. His life is not diminished. It is, if Plato is right, a fully realized one, suited to what he is, expressing his particular kind of excellence without remainder. This image is for many readers the most difficult thing in the Republic to sit with comfortably. The satisfaction of a person whose nature has been identified, educated, and fitted into a social structure that claims to know how to use them. There is something in this that moves against the grain of certain intuitions about freedom, about the right of persons to determine for themselves what they are fitted for and who they wish to become. The philosopher who came after Plato and disagreed most directly with him on precisely this question would argue that the capacity to choose one's own ends, to deliberate over one's own life, is itself the human excellence that any just city must serve and protect. Plato's city does not obviously leave room for this. The farmer who might have been a philosopher if only his education had taken a different turn. This is the gap the structure does not close. But Plato's response, if he were to make it plainly, would be something like this. The freedom that consists in choosing one's own ends without reference to what one's nature actually is fitted for is not freedom at all. It is the freedom of appetite, the freedom of whatever desire happens to be loudest at the moment. Real freedom, the freedom of a soul that can actually determine what is good and move toward it, is only possible for a soul that is already ordered. The disordered soul, the soul in which appetite governs and reason follows, is not free. It is enslaved to its own hungers, mistaking the loudness of its desires for the authority of its choices. This is the argument, and it carries real weight, even against the resistance it generates. Whether it carries enough weight to justify the political arrangements Plato builds from it is another question, one that the Republic continues to ask of its readers across the centuries, never settling entirely. The structure of the four virtues holds in the soul the way an architecture holds in a building, not as ornament, but as load-bearing form. Remove justice, and wisdom has nowhere to operate from. Courage has no governance to protect, Temperance has no agreement to harmonize. All four are simultaneous and mutually supporting. Wisdom knows what the soul's good is. Courage holds to it when the knowing becomes costly. Temperance maintains the agreement among all the parts about who has authority to know. And justice is the condition of all this holding together, the inner order from which all the rest proceeds. There is a moment in Socrates' account when he describes the just soul and the unjust soul in terms that draw on medicine and music. The just soul is harmonious. The unjust soul is diseased. These are not metaphors deployed carelessly. They are doing philosophical work. The appeal to harmony and health is an appeal to something the listener already knows, the difference between a body functioning well and a body in disorder, the difference between a chord that rings true and one that grinds against itself. Plato is proposing that justice is to the soul what health is to the body, and harmony is to music, the condition of right relationship among parts, which produces a kind of functioning that none of the parts disordered could produce alone. The analogy between city and soul has been called imperfect by philosophers who came after Plato, and the imperfection is real. The parts of a city have their own interests, their own suffering, their own agency. The parts of a soul do not have interests in quite the same way. Appetite is not a person with a grievance. Spirit is not an auxiliary who can vote or revolt or refuse to be classified. The move from political structure to psychological structure carries with it a simplification that the political reality does not obviously support. A city of three classes in which each class has been told that its proper function is to serve the function above it is not obviously analogous to a soul in which all three parts serve the good of the whole, because the three classes are persons, with all the complexity and the irreducible selfhood that persons carry. Aristotle, who spent 20 years in Plato's academy before developing his own account of politics and ethics, made a version of this objection. He thought Plato had made the city too unified, had tried to produce the harmony of an organism in what is necessarily the more fractured and plural reality of a community of separate persons. The city is not a soul. The good of the city is not identical to the good of any particular part of it. And governance that treats the city as though it were a unified organism whose parts can be assigned their functions, the way a body assigns functions to its organs, misses something essential about what it means to live among other people, each of whom has their own inner life, their own reasoning faculty, their own claim to consideration. Plato would not have conceded the argument easily. He would have said that the question is what kind of unity the city needs, and that a city without sufficient unity, a city in which every faction pursues its own advantage under the name of its own conception of justice, is not a city at all, but a collection of competing interests wearing the city's name. The unity he wants for Callipolis is not the unity of a single will dominating all others. It is the unity of parts that have found their proper relationship, the unity of the chord, the unity of the healthy body. These are genuine unities. They do not erase the difference between the parts. They organize that difference into a form that serves the whole. The argument and the counter-argument rest here, side by side, as they have rested since Aristotle first made his objection audible. Neither has driven the other out. Both remain live, because the question they are circling, what kind of internal structure makes a community just, and whether the soul and the city share a structure at all, has not been settled, and may not be the kind of question that settles. What settles, or begins to, is the image. In the image Plato has built, the city with its three classes, the soul with its three parts, the four virtues distributed through both. There is something that the listener can feel before they have fully followed the argument. The feeling is of things in their right places, of a structure that holds together because each element is doing what it is fitted to do, and the whole that results from this fitting is something none of the parts alone could have been. This feeling is not proof. Plato would have been the first to say that feelings are not proof, but it is the first recognition, the moment when the shape of an idea becomes felt rather than merely stated, when the abstract structure finds its anchor in something closer to experience. The soul at rest is the soul in which reason and spirit and appetite are each alive and each in their proper place, not suppressed, not at war, not in the endless negotiation of competing hungers, but ordered. The word Plato uses is related to the Greek word for tuning a musical instrument, the well-tuned soul. The soul whose parts are pitched correctly in relation to each other, so that the note produced when they all sound together is clear and resonant, rather than grinding and discordant. In a well-ordered soul, there is no inner conflict, or very little. Reason and spirit and appetite all moving in the same direction, because they have been educated to find the same things genuinely good. The philosopher-ruler who governs Callipolis does not want to eat when reason says it is not time to eat. The guardian who protects the city is not secretly longing to govern it. The farmer who tends the fields does not harbor a persistent resentment that their appetites have been organized into a function. All of this is the end toward which education, in Plato's account, is aimed. Not the suppression of desire, but its transformation, the slow and patient work of bringing each part of the soul into alignment with what the whole soul's good actually requires. Whether this transformation is possible, whether human beings can actually be educated into this kind of internal order, or whether the conflict among the parts of the soul is too fundamental and too intractable to be resolved through even the most careful education, is a question Plato's successors have not finished arguing. The Stoics, some generations later, would pursue a version of this question with their own methods, finding a different answer. The Epicureans would pursue it differently still. The question of how to order the inner life, of which part of the soul ought to govern, and what that governance actually looks like when achieved, became one of the great recurring preoccupations of ancient philosophy, and has not lost that status. But here, in the quieter frame of this particular evening's conversation, the question has found its first large answer. Justice is the right internal order of the parts. In the city, it is each class performing its proper function. In the soul, it is each part, reason, spirit, appetite, in its proper relationship to the others, the whole governed by what genuinely knows best. This is what health looks like, at the level of the self and the community simultaneously. The four virtues rest in their places: wisdom and reason and the rulers, courage and spirit and the auxiliaries, temperance in the agreement among all three parts and all three classes about the authority of the first among them, and justice as the condition in which all of this is possible, the structural rightness that allows each virtue to do its work without displacing the others. The city that Socrates has been building in conversation is a city made of words, and it knows itself to be. No one in the room expects to find Callipolis on any existing map. What they have been building is not a place, but a definition, a description of what the arrangement of human beings together would have to look like for justice to be genuinely present in it, so that they could turn from that description to the question of the soul and read there, in the smaller letters that were always harder to see, the same shape. The shape is held now, quietly, in the structure of an argument that has taken the whole of this long conversation to complete. wisdom in its place, courage in its place, temperance holding the agreement among all the parts, and justice, not as a transaction, not as a balance of power, not as the advantage of the stronger given a more dignified name, but as the condition of the soul in which each part holds to its own, and the whole is, because of this holding, genuinely good. The evening in the Piraeus has settled into full night by now. The harbor sounds have quieted. The men in this room are tired in the way that thinking makes a person tired, not depleted but settled, arrived at a resting place in the argument that is not a conclusion so much as a ledge, a place to stop and look back at the distance covered. Below them, still in memory, all the definitions that did not hold. And here, after all of that, the one that does. Wisdom, where wisdom lives. Courage, where courage lives. Temperance as the accord of all three voices. And justice, the whole of it, the soul in its right arrangement, every part in its proper place, every virtue doing its proper work, the structure of the good life resting there, complete, asking nothing more than to be recognized for what it is. Socrates begins slowly. He is speaking to Glaucon in a room in the Piraeus, and the hour is late, and he raises one hand and begins to draw something in the air, not a diagram, not a shape, but a place, an underground place. He speaks of a dwelling beneath the earth, a kind of cave with a long entrance open toward the light, and of people who have been inside it since childhood, chained at the neck and the legs, so that they can only look at the wall in front of them, and he pauses after each detail to let the image settle, the chains, the firelight behind them, the shadows on the stone. Glaucon says he can see it. Socrates says he can too. The image he is building is not a simple one. It takes time, and Socrates gives it time, because the allegory of the cave is not a riddle to be solved, but a world to be entered, and the entering requires patience. Behind the prisoners, he explains, a fire is burning. Between the fire and the chained figures, other people walk along a raised path, carrying objects, statues of animals, stone figures of people, tools and vessels, and the shadows of these objects fall on the wall, and the shadows are all the prisoners have ever seen. So, the shadows are, for them, the real things, not representations of real things, the things themselves. And if one prisoner were to say to another, that shadow is a dog, or a jar, or a hand, that prisoner would be right, within the only reality they had ever been given to know. Plato wrote this in the 7th book of the Republic, probably sometime in the 380 Des BCE, in the period after the Academy's founding, after the death of Socrates, after his own failed and formative journeys, and the cave is one of those images that does not need to be explained, to be felt. Something in it is already known. There is a particular quality to the experience of realizing that what one had taken for solid ground is only a floor above another floor, that the shapes one had been reading as the world were only casts of a light from a source one had not yet turned to see. Plato had that experience, or believed he did, and the cave is the shape he gave it. What makes the allegory strange and worth sitting with is not the darkness, but what happens when the prisoner is released. Socrates continues, still speaking slowly, and Glaucon still listening. If a prisoner were unchained and made to stand and turn and walk toward the fire, he says, the light would hurt. The eyes that have spent a life reading shadows would be dazzled and confused. The real objects on the walkway, the statues, the figures, would be harder to see than the shadows had been, and the freed prisoner might want to turn back toward the wall, toward the world that the eyes had learned. This is not stupidity. It is what happens when an organ shaped for one kind of seeing is asked to do another kind, and the body, unused to standing, might fall. Someone leads him upward. This is a detail Plato includes without ceremony, and it matters. The ascent is not self-initiated, not simply a consequence of intellectual brilliance, but something that happens through education, through another person who knows the way. The freed prisoner is brought up through the cave's long passage and out into daylight, and the light is overwhelming, painful in a way the firelight inside had not been. The sun is too much, he cannot look at it, and so he begins at the edge. He sees reflections first in pools of water, then the objects themselves in the evening light, then the night sky and the stars, and finally, perhaps after a long time, the sun itself, directly in full light. This sequential movement, not rushing toward the highest thing, but approaching it through its traces first, through the softer and mediated versions of what it is. This is presented by Socrates not as weakness, but as the right method. It is the method of philosophy. It takes as long as it takes. The word Plato uses for this turning is periagogy, a turning of the whole soul, not the accumulation of new information while the soul stays fixed, but a reorientation of everything that does the seeing and the valuing. What is being turned toward is not simply more knowledge, but a different order of reality, and the name Plato gives to what sits at the top of that order is the form of the good. The form of the good is the hardest thing in the Republic to speak about, and Plato knows it, and he refuses to speak about it directly. He approaches it twice by analogy, the way a person approaches a very bright light, never straight on, always from an angle, never touching what the eye cannot hold. The first analogy is the sun, the second is the cave. And in both cases, the philosophical function of the form of the good is the same. It is the source from which both the existence and the knowability of everything else flows. The forms, the permanent, unchanging archetypes of which the things in the world are imperfect copies, do not merely exist alongside the good. They exist because of it, and they can be known because of it. The way visible objects do not merely exist alongside the sun, but exist in the sun's terms, visible by the sun's gift. The good is to the intelligible world what the sun is to the visible one. This analogy sits in the mind in a particular way. It does not resolve into a neat argument. It opens into something larger than an argument can contain, and Plato seems to have known this, because he does not try to push it further. Socrates, in describing the good, says that the good itself is beyond essence, beyond being, surpassing it in dignity and power, and then, as if stepping back from something he has moved too close to, the conversation shifts. The image has done what it can. The rest is for the philosopher who has done the ascending. The prisoner who has reached the sunlight does not stay there. This is the part of the allegory that carries the most weight for the Republic's political argument, and it is the part that Plato handles with the most care, because it is the most difficult. Socrates says, the one who has ascended must go back down, must turn again, away from the sun, toward the underground chamber, toward the people still watching shadows on the wall, toward the life of the city and its needs. The philosopher is not permitted to remain in contemplation. The philosopher must govern. The philosophical argument Plato gives for this is precise. The philosophers owe their formation to the city. Without the city's educational structures, without the years of mathematical training, the dialectic, the long, slow turning toward the good, they would not have become what they are. The debt is real, and justice requires its repayment, and the repayment takes the form of returning to serve. This is the structure of the obligation. But there is something else in it too, something that does not fit neatly into the language of debt and repayment, which is the image of the person at the threshold of the cave, standing at the point where the world opens, choosing to turn back into the dark. Socrates describes this return in a way that does not minimize the cost. He says the philosopher who descends will seem foolish to those below, having been in sunlight and returned to a place where the eyes must readjust to the dark. The philosopher will stumble and see badly at first, will be slower than the cave dwellers at reading the shadows correctly, will speak in ways that seem confused or irrelevant to people for whom the shadows are the real. This is not a triumphant homecoming. It is a particular kind of difficulty that comes from having seen more than the local world can account for, and then being asked to operate within that local world anyway. And yet Plato's argument is that this is precisely the condition under which just governance becomes possible. A city governed by those who want to govern, by those for whom power is itself the destination, will always be governed for the benefit of the governors. The wanting is itself the distortion. The philosopher who has seen the good has something higher to love than political authority, and it is this higher love that makes the lower tasks safe to perform. The reluctance to rule is not a deficiency to be overcome. It is the quality that makes the rule worth having. This is one of Plato's most delicate arguments. It holds together in its own terms with considerable force, and it asks something nearly impossible of the political world, that the most capable should rule without wanting to, that the least corruptible should bear the greatest burden, that authority should flow not toward those who seek it, but away from them, toward those who would prefer to be left alone with the good. A city governed on these terms, if such a city could exist, would be unlike any city that has existed. Plato seems to have known this. The 3 journeys to Syracuse, the philosopher boarding his ship with a manuscript and a hope that a king might be educated into wisdom, these were the attempts to find the gap between the ideal and the actual, and to fill it with philosophy, and the gap did not close. Among those who read Plato most carefully, in the centuries after the Republic was rediscovered in the European tradition, 2 thinkers stand at a particular angle to the philosopher king. Karl Popper, writing in Oxford during the Second World War, found in the philosopher king model something he could not accept. He argued that the concentration of unaccountable authority in a class of guardians who are answerable to no one beneath them, because no one beneath them has the knowledge to hold them accountable, is not a protection against tyranny, but a structural invitation to it. The very architecture of Callipolis, he suggested, is the architecture of the closed society, a self-selected elite, a population managed for their own good, a truth that only some are permitted to know. He did not find this beautiful. He found it dangerous. Popper wrote, as someone who had watched what happened when philosopher kings, or those who styled themselves as such, were given the power their theories seemed to require. He was not wrong about what he had watched, and his reading of Plato is serious and engaged, not dismissive, which is what makes it worth sitting with. The question he was asking was not whether Plato was philosophically clever, but whether the political structure the Republic recommends could be realized without producing the very thing it was meant to prevent, the rule of the unjust over the just. Hannah Arendt came to the Republic from a different angle, and what she found there troubled her for different reasons. Her concern was not with authoritarianism in the obvious sense, but with what she took to be a deeper misunderstanding, a philosophical mistake about the nature of political life itself. Plato models the philosopher king on the craftsman, the person who has a design in mind, a knowledge of what the finished product should look like, and the technical skill to work the material toward that form. The potter knows the shape of the pot before the clay is touched. The philosopher king knows the shape of the just city before the citizens are arranged. In both cases, knowledge precedes action, and action is simply the execution of knowledge. But Arendt argued that this model is wrong about what politics is. Political action, she thought, is not the execution of a pre-existing design. It is something that happens between people in their irreducible plurality, unpredictable, unrepeatable, not fully masterable by any prior intention, and the attempt to treat politics as a craft, to work human beings, the way a craftsman works clay, is not simply authoritarian, but ontologically confused. It mistakes the nature of the medium. People are not clay. Their plurality is not a problem to be managed, but the condition under which anything genuinely political can occur at all. The philosopher who returns to the cave carrying the memory of the good and attempts to shape the city in its image is not a just ruler in Arendt's understanding. The philosopher is someone who has forgotten what cities are made of. These are not easy objections to wave aside, and the Republic has not stopped generating them since it was written. There is something in Plato's vision that produces in those who read it carefully both genuine admiration and genuine unease, and the two responses are not always easy to separate from each other. The beauty of the allegory, the elegance of the city-soul analogy, the seriousness with which Plato takes the question of what it means to live well, these are real, and the questions Popper and Arendt raise are also real, and they were raised by people who were genuinely troubled, not by philosophy's difficulty, but by the shape of the world it seemed to be reaching for. What remains after setting the objections beside the vision is something like the image itself, the philosopher in the sunlight, blinking, then turning back toward the steps that lead down. It is possible to hold Popper's concern and Arendt's concern and still find the image of that turning compelling, not because Callipolis is achievable or because the philosopher king is a political blueprint that should be attempted, but because the question the image is asking, whether there is any mode of authority that is genuinely in the service of something beyond itself, is not a question that Popper or Arendt dissolves. It persists. The cave is still there, and the fire is still burning, and the shapes passing on the walkway still cast their shadows, and what the shadows are shadows of is still, after all this time, worth asking. The sun analogy, which appears just before the cave in Book 6, is worth resting in for a moment, because it does something the cave does not. Where the cave moves, where it is a story of ascent and descent, of movement and return, the sun analogy holds still. Socrates says, as the sun is in the visible realm, so the good is in the intelligible realm. The sun gives the things of the visible world not only the light by which they are seen, but the very possibility of their being seen at all, and more than this, the possibility of their being. Remove the sun, and there is no visibility, and no growth, and no being of the things that depend on it. In the same way, the form of the good gives the forms not only their knowability, but their very existence. This is a large claim, quietly made, and what makes it feel like something other than a technical philosophical thesis, what makes it feel like something that can be approached at night, in the dark, without effort, is the sun itself. The sun is not a stranger. It is the oldest familiar thing in the human inheritance, the thing that every generation has looked at and known, the thing that the prisoners in the cave are being prevented from seeing, and the thing the philosopher reaches at the end of a long ascending. To say that what the good is to thought, the sun is to sight, is to set the highest philosophical abstraction inside the most ordinary sensory experience, and to ask, have you not already felt in some dim way what the form of the good is? Have you not already had the experience of understanding suddenly illuminated, of a question coming clear, of a previously obscure thing becoming all at once visible in its full shape. Yes, Plato seems to be saying that is what it is like, only larger, only all the way through. The philosopher who descends the steps of the cave carries the sun's memory. This is not a metaphor Plato makes explicit, but it is implicit in the logic of the ascent. Having seen the source of all intelligibility, the philosopher brings back something that does not translate easily into the language of shadows. And this, the difficulty of translation, the gap between what is known in the light and what can be communicated in the dark, is one of the quiet sorrows of the philosopher's political life, and one that Plato knew personally. There are things that philosophy finds at its deepest that the political world cannot use directly. The return asks the philosopher to make what they have found useful, and the task is genuine, and its difficulty is genuine, and the philosopher who has truly ascended goes back anyway, because justice asks it. The form of the good has accumulated centuries of interpretation, and the interpretations are various enough to suggest that the idea is genuinely inexhaustible. Neoplatonic thinkers, following Plotinus, pushed the good toward a kind of mystical unity beyond all predication, a one from which all being emanates, and toward which all contemplation tends. Medieval Christian philosophers found in the good a resonance with the divine nature, and the identification of the Platonic form with God gave the idea a theological life that extended far beyond anything the Republic explicitly contains. Analytic philosophers of the 20th century tried to reconstruct the form of the good in more sober terms, as a formal principle of practical reason, as an account of what makes something worth choosing, and found the idea more tractable and more contestable than its mystical interpreters had. What all these interpretations share is the recognition that Plato was pointing at something for which he did not have a final word, and that the refusal to provide a final word was not evasion, but philosophical honesty. The form of the good cannot be defined as if it were an ordinary object of knowledge, because it is the condition of all ordinary knowledge, the light by which definitions are possible at all. To ask what the good is in the way one might ask what justice is, or what courage is already to misunderstand what kind of thing the good is. It is not an object alongside others. It is the source from which all the others receive their light. This is perhaps the moment in the Republic where the philosophical argument opens into something that cannot be held entirely in argument, where the systematic inquiry reaches a point at which it must stop being systematic and become something else, an image, a gesture, a sun in the sky. Plato does not apologize for this. He seems, in the way he handles the passage, to regard it as the natural limit of the method, not as a failure of it. The method of dialectic, the patient ascent through hypothesis and refutation and progressive illumination, leads somewhere that the method cannot entirely describe. And what it leads to, Plato holds, is worth going toward even if the arrival cannot be rendered fully in words. The philosopher sits for a long moment at the top of the allegory before looking at the sun directly, having approached through water's reflection, through objects in evening light, through stars and moon. There is a period of stillness before the final turn. This moment of stillness is easy to overlook in the momentum of the image, but it has a particular quality, the quality of standing at the edge of the largest thing one has encountered, and not rushing at it, not seizing it, but letting the eyes continue to adjust, trusting that what is there will not move, that patience is the right instrument here. The sun will not leave. The good is not impatient. The philosopher who has come this far can afford to take the final step slowly, because what is true without urgency, and what can be known through this long, careful approach will be known more fully, for the approach having been careful. When the philosopher is asked to return, and the asking comes from Socrates, which means it comes from the argument itself, from the logic of what justice requires, the turn is made without drama. Plato does not give us the philosopher's inner life at this moment. We do not know if there is grief or relief or simply the settling of an obligation. What we are given is the direction, back down the steps, back into the passage, back toward the fire's inferior light, and the shadows on the wall, and the people who will not initially believe a word of what has been seen above. The philosopher enters the shadows with the sun still present in some way, held behind the eyes, not as a possession, but as an orientation. A person who knows which direction the light comes from, even in a room where the light is indirect and filtered and partial, knows something important. The knowing does not make the room brighter, but it changes the quality of the attention brought to it. Popper's worry, held at the calm distance it deserves, amounts to this, that the philosopher who returns carrying certainty about the good may not be as different from the tyrant as Plato intends, because certainty of this kind, combined with political authority, has historically produced something other than justice. The philosopher king, in practice, tends to look less like the reluctant guardian of the form, and more like the ordinary human being in possession of power and a theory. This is a serious concern. It is not a refutation of Plato's metaphysics. It is an observation about the distance between the philosophical ideal and the human capacity to instantiate it, and Plato himself, standing on the deck of a ship, watching the Sicilian coastline, and knowing by the third voyage that the thing he had hoped for would not happen, had already lived that observation. Arendt's concern is slightly different, and in some ways quieter. She is not worried that the philosopher king will become a tyrant. She is worried that the philosopher king will succeed, will actually arrange the city according to the good, will produce the order that Callipolis describes, and that this success will have destroyed something that the theory does not have a name for. The something it will have destroyed is the political itself, the space of speech and action between plural, unpredictable, irreducibly different human beings, where no prior knowledge determines the outcome and no single expertise is sufficient. For Arendt, the loss of this space, even in the name of justice, even in the name of the good, is not a gain. It is the loss of the thing that makes the city worth governing in the first place. These two thinkers, reading the same text in the middle of the 20th century, with the century's particular darkness in view, arrive at related but distinct forms of unease, and the Republic responds to neither of them in any direct way, because the Republic was not written for the 20th century and could not have been. What Plato wrote was written for a world in which one city's assembly had raised its hands and voted a just man to death, and in which the question of what justice was had become, for that reason, personally urgent and philosophically foundational. The arguments that followed from that urgency are serious arguments. They have generated serious responses. The conversation has not ended and shows no sign of ending, which is, in the terms of the Republic itself, evidence that the question is genuinely difficult, the kind of difficulty that does not yield to a single lifetime of inquiry, but continues to be worth the inquiry nonetheless. The sun sits above the cave, indifferent to the argument about whether the philosopher should return, and the cave sits below it, with its fire and its chains and its wall of shadows, and the philosopher has already turned back, is already partway down the steps, carrying the only thing that survives the descent, not the sun itself, which cannot be carried, but the memory of having faced it. The eyes are adjusting. The fire's light is becoming legible again. The shadows are taking their familiar shapes on the stone. Below, the city is waiting in its complexity and its noise and its endless appetite for what is good without always knowing what goodness is. The philosopher enters it, not because the city deserves the philosopher, or because the philosopher will succeed, or because the gap between the form of the good and the best available political arrangement can be closed entirely, but because the question of how to live well together is worth one's full attention, and because the person who has seen the good and returns to serve carries, in the quality of that attention, something that would otherwise be absent from the city entirely. The allegory does not close with a resolution, it closes with an image, the released prisoner having seen the sun brought back into the cave, temporarily blinded by the shift from greater to lesser light, stumbling a little, beginning again to make out the shapes. The other prisoners, who have never left, think the person has been damaged. The journey upward has ruined his eyes for this place. He cannot see the shadows as well as they can. And if he were to try to release them, to describe the sun and the real things, they would not believe him, and if pressed, might try to kill him. This last detail arrives quietly, without emphasis. But it is there, and it is about Socrates, and Plato knew it was about Socrates, and every reader has always known it was about Socrates. The philosopher who returns from the light to serve the city takes on a real risk. The city's default is to trust the shadows. The person who points at the sun is in the city's terms the confused one. Plato set all of this down in the Republic, and then spent the rest of his life returning to the questions it opened. The Academy continued for generations after his death, and the arguments about the form of the good and the philosopher king and the nature of justice continued to move through them, and through the long chain of readers and inheritors that stretches from the olive grove outside Athens to the wartime offices of Oxford and beyond. The cave is still there in the sense that matters, still present in every serious attempt to ask what it is that the most capable people owe to the communities that formed them, still present in every conversation about whether knowledge of the good, if such a thing exists, confers the right to govern those who lack it, still present in the quiet and persistent difficulty of the question itself. And above all of it, the sun sits in the same position it has always held in the analogy, not moving, not arguing, giving light and existence to everything that can receive them, asking nothing in return. The philosopher who has looked at it and returned to the shadows carries the light behind the eyes, and the light is not diminished by the carrying, and the shadows on the wall are still only shadows, and the question of what they are shadows of is still, in the dark and in the quiet, the best question there is. The steps of the cave go downward, the philosopher descends. The sun remains above, the same sun it has always been, holding everything that can be held in its light, and the memory of it, carried down into the dark, rests there quietly, like something known and not yet needing to be said. In the 8th book of the Republic, Socrates pauses before he begins his account of political decline, and says something to Glaucon that sounds at first almost playful. He says that the muses will tell them how the fall begins, and then he gives the muses a voice, and they speak about numbers, specific, strange, astronomical numbers, the kind of calculation that governs when human beings of the best and worst natures are born. And Socrates admits, almost in the same breath, that the calculation is difficult, and that the guardians may make an error, not a moral error, a mathematical one. The first guardians of Callipolis, the beautiful city, will miscalculate. They will bring together the wrong people at the wrong time, and the children who result will be slightly different from the children that should have been born. and those children will love honor where their parents loved wisdom. And what had been a city held together by reason will become, almost without noticing, a city held together by pride. The decline begins there, in a miscalculation, in something almost invisible, not in a tyrant seizing power, not in a war, not in any of the large and obvious ways that great things come apart. The first step downward is so small that it barely looks like a step at all. It looks like a note, going slightly flat in a chord that still sounds mostly right. And for a time, perhaps for many years, the chord still sounds mostly right, and no one can say exactly when it stops sounding the way it should. This is the shape that Plato gives to moral decline: gradual, internal, nearly imperceptible, until the moment when it is not. Socrates is speaking to Glaucon, and the afternoon light has shifted in the way that afternoon light in the Peri shifts when the harbor breeze stills and the shadows begin to lengthen. They have been at this conversation for a long time. They have built a city in speech, have populated it with three kinds of people, have given it four virtues, have traced its justice to the quiet correspondence between what each part of the whole does and what each part of the whole is most fitted to do. And now Socrates is about to dismantle it. He is about to show what happens when that correspondence breaks apart, when the parts no longer hold to their proper functions, when what should govern stops governing, and what should be governed begins to want the throne. He does this not because he delights in the dismantling, but because the argument requires it. If justice is a kind of inner order, then injustice must be a kind of inner disorder, and to understand one you must follow the other all the way down to its end. The city called democracy comes first. It still has structure, still has law, still has a certain vigorous dignity, but its guardians have begun to prefer honor to wisdom, victory to truth. They still disdain money, at least in the early stages, still hold themselves to something like a military standard. But the love of honor carries within it the seed of something worse, because honor is not self-sustaining in the way that wisdom is. Wisdom is content with its own exercise. Honor requires an audience. It requires comparison, competition, the public recognition of someone else who sees and confirms your superiority. And in that need for recognition, something in the city has already turned outward in a way that makes it vulnerable. The soul that corresponds to this city is the soul of a man who is vigorous, proud, and genuinely capable of discipline, but whose discipline serves his image rather than his understanding. He was raised, Plato suggests, by a father who had something of the philosopher in him, but his mother complained. His mother said that his father was too quiet, too unwilling to compete, too little concerned with what others thought. And the boy grew up between those two influences, the father who looked inward, the mother who looked at the world through the eyes of the world. He is, in the end, his mother's son. He works hard. He respects courage. He will not take a bribe. But he does not know what he is for, exactly, except to be the best at whatever the city currently admires. And this not knowing, this gap at the center of his sense of purpose, is what makes everything that follows possible. From democracy comes oligarchy. The step is not abrupt. What happens is that the love of honor gradually discovers that money is one of the most reliable producers of the recognition it wants. The city begins to care about property. First, it cares about property alongside honor, and then it cares about property instead of honor. And the transition happens quietly, the way most transitions towards something worse happen quietly. And now the city has two populations, those who have wealth and those who do not, and a third population of the spirit, the ones who might have been philosophers or soldiers, who now drift between the two, owned by neither, loyal to nothing in particular. The virtue of the oligarchic city is a thin kind of self-control, the restraint of a man who does not spend too freely because he knows that spending freely puts his position at risk. It is not temperance, it is caution. These are not the same thing, and Plato wants the distinction to be felt. The oligarchic man has a corresponding soul. He has suppressed his appetites, but not transformed them. They sit beneath the surface, quieted by calculation rather than by wisdom, waiting. He saves, he works, he is careful. But there is something about him that has never been genuinely educated, some part of him that his wealth has covered over rather than shaped. And the children of this careful, covered over man grow up watching their father defer to money, and only to money. They see that the city respects wealth. They see that they are wealthy. And then, at some point, through the ordinary mechanisms of fortune, they are not, or they see others who are not. And the children who grew up in the house of caution become the generation that decides that caution is a prison. Democracy arrives, in Plato's account, not as a gift, but as a kind of psychological release. The oligarchic city produces its poor, and the poor eventually demand what the city's logic says they should have, and the walls come down, and suddenly all desires are equal, all ways of life are equally permitted. A man may spend his morning with philosophy, and his afternoon in the gymnasium, and his evening with wine, and no one may tell him that one of these is better than the others, because the democratic city does not make that kind of judgment. It is, Plato says, a beautiful city. In a way, it is variegated like a coat of many colors. It is full of different kinds of lives and different kinds of voices. You can find anything you are looking for there, if what you are looking for is variety. But the democratic soul is a soul in which no desire takes precedence over any other desire. The appetite for philosophy and the appetite for wine and the appetite for honor all receive equal time, equal respect, equal gratification when gratification is available. And what this looks like from the inside, Plato suggests, is not freedom but drift. The democratic man does not choose his pleasures from any stable center. He is chosen by them, in sequence, each one holding the helm for a while until it tires or is replaced. He is pleasant to be around. He is various. He is genuinely difficult to dislike. And he has no self, in the sense that Plato means self, no inner order, no part of him that governs consistently, no governing at all. The pleasant, restless movement of his days tells no time. It has no orientation toward the good, because the democratic city and the democratic soul have agreed together that there is no better direction, only more directions, and from this city without a center, from this soul without governance, tyranny grows. Plato traces the mechanism with the diagnostic patience of someone who has watched it happen in the world, rather than only in his imagination. The democratic city, which has made freedom its highest value, will eventually find that freedom in the hands of men who love power, becomes the freedom to take freedom away. The demagogue rises within the democratic city as a champion of the people. He speaks the language of liberation and grievance. He names the enemies, the wealthy, the old families, the educated, and the city, which has no principle by which to judge him except popularity, finds itself gathered around him, and around the demagogue the guardians of tyranny begin to form. Not the guardians of Callipolis with their careful education and their philosophers above them, a different kind of guard, men whose specific function is violence and whose specific virtue is loyalty to one man. The tyrant himself sits at the end of this sequence as the most vivid portrait of what a soul completely disordered by appetite looks like when it holds political power. He appears strong. He has guards. He has the city. He has, in the most obvious sense, everything, and he has nothing, in the sense that Plato means having. He is ruled by a master passion, so consuming that he cannot sleep, cannot trust, cannot rest for a moment inside himself without anxiety. He is, Plato says, the least free person in the city he governs absolutely. His appetite rules him as completely as he rules his subjects. And what he wants is not satisfiable, not because the object of desire is unavailable, but because desire of this kind, appetitive desire in command of a soul without reason, cannot be satisfied in principle. It feeds and grows hungry again, and the hunger is sharper each time. And the city must pay for each new hunger, and the city grows afraid, and the tyrant grows more afraid than the city. And in this mutual fear, held in place by violence, the long fall from wisdom to appetite comes to its lowest point. Plato asks, in the middle of this account, which man is happiest? The tyrant, who has everything and is absolutely enslaved, or the philosopher, who has removed himself from the pursuit of political power and tends to the order of his own soul? The question is not rhetorical, in the sense that Plato frames it as a genuine calculation rather than a declaration. He works through it carefully, arguing that the pleasures of the philosophical life are not only more virtuous, but more real, in the precise sense that they are stable and self-sustaining, where the pleasures of appetite are unstable and self-consuming. The pleasure of learning something is the same at the end of the day as it was at the beginning. The pleasure of a satisfied appetite diminishes the moment satisfaction arrives and begins immediately to require renewal. And across the full span of a life, Plato argues the mathematical difference between these two kinds of pleasure is enormous. The philosopher's life contains far more of the genuine article, and the tyrant's far less, than anyone who did not work through the geometry would suspect. This argument about happiness is one of the places where Plato's philosophy is most distinctly itself. He is not merely saying that virtue leads to external rewards or social approval. He is saying that virtue is happiness, in the sense that a well-ordered soul is a well-functioning soul, and a well-functioning soul experiences its life more fully and more genuinely than a disordered one, regardless of what the disordered soul accumulates on the outside. The just person does not need good fortune to be happy. The unjust person cannot be made happy by good fortune. This is the argument at its most compressed, and its simplest form is the one that has been returned to most often, that the soul in good order is its own reward, and no external condition can take that reward from it. The definition of justice that this argument rests on arrived, in the conversation's long day, somewhere in the middle in Book 4, after the city had been built in speech, and its virtues located and named. Justice, Socrates told Glaucon, is not a relation between one person and another, not a rule about returning what is borrowed, or giving each what is owed. It is an internal condition. It is the condition of a soul, in which each part performs its proper function without interfering with the others. Reason governing, spirit enforcing, reason's governance, appetite providing the energy of desire that the whole needs to function, but appetite in its proper place below, oriented rather than commanding. This is justice, and injustice is the disruption of this arrangement, the wrong thing in the wrong place, pulling against the grain of the whole. What this means for the 5 constitutions and their corresponding souls is that the sequence from aristocracy to tyranny is not merely a political history, it is a moral gradient. Each step down the sequence is a step toward greater internal disorder in the corresponding type of soul. The timocratic man is slightly less ordered than the aristocratic man. The oligarchic man slightly less than the timocratic. The democratic man lives in something approaching full internal anarchy, his reason not overthrown, but simply ignored, each appetite taking its turn without any authority to determine which should govern. And the tyrannical man has handed reason's throne to the single most consuming desire in his psychology, which then rules with the same absolute and unjust authority that the tyrant exercises over his city. The outer mirrors the inner. The constitution of the city is the constitution of the soul, made large enough to read. This mirroring was Plato's central methodological claim. The reason he built the city in speech before looking for justice in the soul, because the letters were large enough in the city to be legible, and once legible in the city, they could be recognized in the smaller writing of individual psychology. And the claim, held from the other direction, is that what produces corrupt cities is not bad law or bad luck or external invasion, but the prevalence of certain kinds of souls among the citizenry. Corrupt cities and corrupt souls produce each other, turn by turn, generation by generation, neither one the root cause, because the root is the relation between them. A city full of honor-loving men will become a timocracy without anyone deciding to make it one. A city full of men ruled by appetite will become a democracy or a tyranny without anyone having to force the result. The city grows from the people, and the people are shaped by the city, and Plato traces this mutual shaping, not with the detached curiosity of a political scientist, but with the attention of someone who believes the stakes are nothing less than the quality of every life lived within these arrangements. The question this raises, and the one that the Republic does not entirely put to rest, is whether the soul's order can survive the disorder of the city around it. Whether a just soul can persist inside an unjust political arrangement, or whether the soul is inevitably shaped by its political environment to the point where escape is not possible. Plato's answer to this question is indirect, and it comes not in the body of the argument, but at its close in the story he places at the very end, the myth that a soldier named tells after returning from the dead, the account of what the soul encounters after one life ends and before another begins. Died on a battlefield, or nearly died, and came back to report what he had seen. He saw souls gathered in a great meadow between the sky and the earth, some descending from above, with the particular brightness of those who have been rewarded for just lives, some ascending from below, with the particular heaviness of those who have been punished for unjust ones. He saw them rest together in the meadow for a time, comparing their journeys, and then he saw what happened next. The souls were called forward to choose their next lives. There were more lives available than there were souls choosing, and the lives came in every variety imaginable. Lives of great political power, lives of modest private pleasure, lives of animals, lives of men and women, lives that looked magnificent from the outside and were miserable within, lives that looked small and turned out to be full of the things that matter. And each soul chose in the order determined by lot, and the choosing was entirely its own. Before the choosing began, a prophet addressed the assembled souls. He told them that the blame belongs to the one who chooses. He told them that the God is blameless. This line, "The blame belongs to the one who chooses, the God is blameless," is the sentence Plato places at the hinge of the myth, and its weight is considerable. It is not merely a statement about divine innocence. It is a statement about where the responsibility for the quality of a life ultimately rests. Not in the city you inhabit, not in the fortune you are assigned, not in the body you are born into, but in the choosing soul itself, in the orientation it brings to the moment of decision, in the wisdom or lack of wisdom it has accumulated through whatever living it has done before. The soul of Orpheus, unable to choose a human life after what women had done to him, chose to be born as a swan. The soul of Ajax, still carrying the memory of the judgment of arms, chose a lion rather than anything human. The soul of Agamemnon, sickened by what men had done to him, chose to be an eagle. Each chose from what it had learned, or failed to learn, from what it had suffered rather than understood. And the soul of Odysseus, the soul that had wandered furthest, suffered longest, been tried by every variety of fortune, had searched a long time through the available lives, and finally found what it wanted in a quiet corner, a life without ambition, a private life, a life that no one else had wanted, because no one else had understood why it was worth choosing. And having found it, the soul of Odysseus settled into that modest life with something that the myth does not name, but that holds in it something like contentment, like the recognition at last of what it had always wanted, which was not conquest or return or even love, but simply the conditions of a life that would not pull against itself. This choice, unheroic, quiet, unrecognized by anyone watching, is offered by Plato without commentary. It is placed there at the end of the longest philosophical dialogue of antiquity, and allowed to mean what it means without elaboration. The soul that had seen most chose least, and chose well. And the myth allows this to be either a statement about Odysseus or a statement about what wisdom, at its most honest, tends to want, not the life that is most admired, but the life that is most genuinely livable. After the choosing, the souls move to the plain of forgetting, where the river Lethe flows. Each soul drank from it, and the drinking wiped away the memory of everything it had learned in the space between lives, the meadow, the rewards, the punishments, the moment of choosing. The next life would begin clean, but Plato lets observe that some drank more than required, and some, perhaps those who had been most careful, who had guarded their wisdom most deliberately, drank just enough and preserved something, some orientation that the water could not entirely reach, something that was not memory but was not entirely erased either, a way of tending toward the good that persisted beneath the forgetting, like a set of coordinates drawn in water, that the river smoothed over but did not entirely dissolve. The myth closes the Republic in a particular key, not with the city, not with the philosopher king, not with the argument about which constitution is most just or which soul is most happy, but with the individual soul, alone in a meadow, holding the accumulated weight of its choices, responsible entirely for the next choice it is about to make. The whole philosophical edifice, the city built in speech, the tripartite psychology, the four virtues located in their proper places, the sun and the line and the cave, the five constitutions traced from aristocracy down to tyranny, all of it has been building not toward a political prescription, but toward this, the soul that chooses well, whose choosing is made possible by the quality of order it has cultivated within itself, regardless of what the city around it decided to become. Plato was not naive about cities. The 3 voyages to Syracuse, the execution of Socrates, the 30 tyrants governing behind the Acropolis. He had seen what cities do when they are disordered, and he had seen it clearly enough that he never stopped believing it mattered enormously what kind of soul governed what kind of city. But the Republic's final move, the myth that places the soul in a meadow, choosing its next life without the scaffolding of any city at all, suggests something else as well, that the project of justice is not only political, that the soul's own ordering, its own cultivation of reason over appetite, is not merely instrumental to the city's health, but is, in the end, the thing itself, the thing the Republic has been about all along, the thing that can persist even when the city fails, even when the democratic man is elected, and the tyrant rises, and the philosopher descends reluctantly back into the cave and finds no one willing to believe him. The argument, taken as a whole, rests on a claim about what is genuinely good, not good for the city, not good in the judgment of the many, not good as measured by power or wealth or popularity, but good in the sense that a soul in proper order is better off than a soul disordered, the way a body in health is better off than a body in sickness, and that this is true whether or not the city recognizes it, whether or not anyone watching from outside can see the difference. The just soul may be poor, it may be ignored, it may be, in the worst case, the soul that is tried and condemned and forced to drink hemlock in a room with its friends. And even then, in Plato's accounting, the just soul has something that the tyrant on his throne does not have and cannot purchase, the particular stillness of a life whose inner arrangement is not at war with itself. This is a claim that has been questioned seriously and often. The long conversation the Republic has generated, from Aristotle, who doubted whether the city could be held together by the kind of unity Plato described, to later philosophers who found in his political proposals the shape of something authoritarian, to thinkers who argued that the irreducible plurality of human action cannot be mastered by any philosophical expertise. This conversation has not arrived at an agreed verdict on whether Plato was right. The honest answer is that the question is still open. What it means for justice to be an internal condition, and how that internal condition relates to the external structures of political life, whether a just soul truly can flourish inside an unjust city, or whether the soul's ordering and the city's ordering are too deeply entangled to separate. These are questions that the Republic raises more clearly than it resolves. And this irresolution is not a failure of the text. It is, in a sense, the most honest thing about it. Plato did not write the Republic as a handbook for building the ideal state. He wrote it as a philosophical investigation into what justice is, conducted through the longest and most patient method available, the careful accumulation of argument, image, myth, and analogy across 10 books, and the investigation produced not a settled answer, but a particular way of holding the question, with attention, with the willingness to follow the argument wherever it goes, with the recognition that the shape of justice is visible first in the soul, and that the soul is a better starting place than the city, because cities can be corrupted from without, but the soul's orientation toward the good is something it can, if it chooses, tend from within. The myth of air ends with air waking on the funeral pyre, the memory of the meadow still intact, the other souls already scattered into their new lives. He wakes and is alive, and he has been sent back to tell what he has seen, so that the account may serve as a kind of navigation. The soul, knowing that the choosing will come, may prepare itself by cultivating the kind of inner order that will allow it to choose wisely when the moment arrives. The practical instruction, if there is one, is this: tend to the soul now, while there is time, while the philosophical conversation is still possible, while reason is still available to do the work that reason is fitted to do, not so that the city will be improved, though it might be, not so that others will recognize your virtue, though perhaps they will, but because the soul in good order is more genuinely alive, more genuinely itself, more genuinely at home inside its own life, and no external fortune can give this to a disordered soul or take it from an ordered one. The olive trees outside the academy cast the same long shadows at evening that they cast in Plato's time, or something like them, the light in that particular corner of the world having the quality of light that does not rush. The questions that were taken up in that garden, what is justice? What is the good? What kind of soul is truly free? Are still present in the same way that the grove is still present, not as monuments, but as living conditions, as the ground that a certain kind of thinking grows in, requiring no resolution to remain hospitable to the thinking that continues within them. Somewhere in the meadow that described, the souls are choosing. They carry what they have learned and what they have failed to learn, and they carry it forward into the next shape of a life, and the choosing is entirely theirs. The God is blameless. The prophet folds his hands and steps aside. The lottery falls as it falls, and the soul that has been most careful, that has tended most honestly to its own ordering, that has not confused the admired life with the good one, moves quietly through the available lives and finds what it was looking for in a corner that no one else considered, and chooses it, and is content. Above the meadow, the night holds steady. The stars are where they have always been.